Hey everyone. In spite of all the rosy forecasts and sunny ways, right, that's put forth and presented by not just your political masters here in Canada, but even your media overlords, right? They're they're lackeys that repeat and regurgitate the talking points of their central planning overlords, right? But you've heard all this crap, whether it's from the central banker, right, Polas, or from the CBC or some of the other establishment media outlets, or like Trudeau and his lackeys. Oh, the Canadian economy, we're doing so great. And then in the past few years, how they were talking down through their noses at the Americans and the Europeans and other these Western developed countries. Oh, they've gone through all this pain and hardship, but look at Canada, we're doing so great. People like myself, of course, even though my voice has very small, like it's almost a whisper in comparison to the kind of platforms these people have, but hey, it's still there. And I've been telling you people, and a few others like myself have been telling you, is yeah, don't listen to that rhetoric. It's bullshit. In reality, what it means, all it is they're taking a snapshot in time, right? And it's like when you're behind the times, yeah, if you just show a picture of you way at the back, well, if you don't put in perspective that everyone's ahead of you, if you just take a picture of you running the race and nobody close to you, it might look like, or you could present the narrative that you're way out in front. In reality, you're away at the back. And Canada's turn to suffer some financial pain, some hardships, to put the economy truly back on the proper track to prosperity, right? Yeah, that's it's going to happen, folks, whether these people want to admit it or not. But like I say, political propagandists, they don't want to tell you the truth. They want to keep that narrative going. And for some of them, especially special interest groups, real estate execs, banksters, there's some special interest groups that benefit tremendously from keeping this false pretense hum along. But there are counter narratives. And not just people like myself, right, with very small platforms to get our voices out there. This is Bloomberg. And I mean, like, it's not the first one, but headline from this Bloomberg article, and it's going to be, I'm going to share some audio with you too. The headline is Canada's economy on the verge of a financial crisis? I would say yes. Like I say, source Bloomberg. But I'm just going to play this audio portion so you can hear what this gentleman has to say, and then we'll touch down on and reflect on exactly what he's putting forth and presented. Because I actually agree. I've listened to it already, and I would agree wholeheartedly that he seems to have a much better grasp on the underlying fundamentals of the Canadian economy.
You have a real serious warning that we are indeed, I can say you because you live there as well, looking at a bubble in Canada, and that it will burst, and that it will cause a financial crisis.
Yes, it's a major bubble. It's 3 times the house prices from 15 years ago, which is, as far as I could tell in my research, never happens. It's happened a couple of times, and of course you experienced that in the United States with the bubble, but the bubble in Canada is actually a little bit bigger than the bubble was in the United States before it burst. So, but along with that is the personal debt level, the household debt level. So in Canada, in the private sector debt, we're at 200% of GDP. There's only about 5 countries in the whole world that have that elevated a private sector debt ratio. And that's a big warning sign for a financial crisis.
And that's something that people have been warning about for a while. Luke, when it comes to Canadian real estate, there's Toronto and Vancouver, and then there's everyone else, right? You've got inflated prices in those 2 cities, but you don't see it in Montreal and Quebec City, in Edmonton or Calgary.
Exactly. Well, you don't really see the same level of home price appreciation right now. However, some economists would argue that, just because the rate has moderated, still at a stock, it's at a very high level. And I think that's one thing with all these rule changes today that's kind of catching people off guard. These are not really targeted measures to cool Toronto and Vancouver the way Morneau's last little 500,000 change was. This one on the mortgage rules, it's really going to affect the provision of credit across the board. But we were expecting more targeted measures, right? Can you even do that? Is that possible?
I don't really think so. I think when they actually got into it, they realized that they had to do it on a broader basis, and these measures are fairly small steps, if you like. Although it is pretty significant, like qualifying for a 5-year. It's a little bit different in Canada. You only get your fixed rate for 5 years in Canada. In the U.S., of course, it's for the whole 30 years. So But the qualification now is going to be based on a much higher interest rate. So the young couple with, say, $100,000 in income in Canada, before could qualify, say, for a $660,000 mortgage. Now they'll only be qualifying for a $500,000 mortgage. And that's going to make it very difficult for them to buy a house. But just to correct one thing I think that's sort of leaked into this thing is actually house prices have increased pretty well everywhere in Canada, you know, from a lower base. But in Alberta, where I'm from, for example, house prices have tripled as well in Calgary and Edmonton.
Over 15 years.
Over 15 years.
Yeah, so a longer term view. But if we do see, although it's unfortunate for young people who want to buy, you know, a bigger house or in a nicer neighborhood, that has to take some of the demand out of the equation, right? I mean, that has to help to deflate. Isn't it possible that we could see the housing bubble, instead of burst, like deflate in a very nice and positive way?
I always get asked about the possibility of a soft landing, and so there's two things to say about that. First of all, a fellow named Jeremy Grantham, who you might know in
Of course.
Boston, he's investigated 28 bubbles, and he didn't find a single one that had a soft landing. But also, when you think about it, tripling of the house prices, when wages are only up probably 20%, it would take decades of flat house prices to get back to where the ratio is in line. And of course, the problem with that, with decades, is we usually have a recession every 6 or 7 years, or sooner. So when the next recession comes, then the opportunity for a soft landing will be removed. So that's the issue there.
So Hilliard, we talk a lot about, you know, possible triggers for this Canadian housing burst, and you know, you didn't write this book yesterday. Some time has passed happened. So we've had oil since. We have the possibility of, you know, importing higher rates from the U.S. And now more and more we have the government getting involved with the market, possibly at a later stage in this housing boom. So when you rank these triggers, what do you see as being the one that really we should be keeping our eyes on? What could really take the wind right out of the market sails?
Well, I think it's recession. You know, Alberta is in a recession. Alberta is 20% of the Canadian GDP with 11% of the population. And a recession, you know, people get laid off. They're a young couple with double incomes. One of them gets laid off. There's a divorce, any kind of possibility. And you know, it only takes 5 or 10% of the houses to get into difficulty, as you discovered in the United States. And it drags all the house prices down. So I think a recession is probably the most likely thing to happen. But if banks were to discover that they were lending money to people that can't pay the money back, and they decide to change who they lend money to, that could also be a trigger. And that might be something that sort of started the process today with the changes in the rules.
C.D. Howe Institute has suggested that Canada should build a fund to cover taxpayer losses of up to $9 billion Canadian, which the government could then tap in case of mass defaults. What do you think about an approach like that? Is that feasible?
Well, there's something we haven't talked about. CMHC. CMHC is unique in the world. So this is where the lenders can lend, as long as they follow the rules, they can lend as much money as they want to as many people as they want. They don't have to be particularly well qualified. You could almost call it subprime, except in Canada we're not allowed to call it subprime. And this government insurance agency insures the mortgage, not for the house buyer, but for the lender. So that is the thing that keeps it going. But if CMHC were to get into trouble, there's $500 billion of mortgages insured in CMHC. And so the numbers would be much, much, much bigger than $9 billion. It would be in the $50 billion range, probably.
Hilliard, what's the biggest risk to your forecast, to your outlook? I mean, what could save Canada?
You know, I think, like everybody says, if Donald Trump gets elected, they're all going to move to Canada. So that would probably be it.
So there you go. As you heard from Mr. Hilliard himself, and you did hear that S word that you'll never hear passed around, right? In Canada, subprime. But with CMHC, which is basically this entity that can use the taxpayer, you responsible Canadians, as the backstop for all this reckless lending, you know, that's that thing where, you know, it's not, I mean, it sounds good to investors because, like, wow, it sounds like we got this safe venue and this safe entity that'll prevent us from suffering any losses. But like with governments, especially in central planners, they can change the rules at any time, at any stage, or they could revert back to saying, oh, none of this was legit in the first place, right? Which it's not. I mean, to pretend that you can just use responsible people's money to bail out the most irresponsible people, or the irresponsible lenders, I mean, that's already a false pretense and a false dialogue, and completely immoral and unethical to begin with. But what this whole thing is saying to you is, yeah, I mean, think about it. These people have this false pretense, this false belief that they're going to be able to force these debt obligations, no matter how they go about, right? No matter how bad actors, how many misdeeds and malinvestments and immoral acts these central planners type carry out, that don't worry, the Canadian taxpayer will always bail you out. Well, I mean, if you believe that foolishness, right? If you truly, genuinely believe that foolishness, then, keep going along. Keep believing that shit. Stay playing that game. But in the end, as this gentleman is suggesting, and a lot of actually economically astute people, that's the thing. There are some, people like Peter Schiff and many others. It's just that they don't get the platform on the main stage to hear it put forth and presented, their message, their dialogue, their narrative, quite as much as you would hear from the central planning types, the ones that want to keep that bubble, expanding at a constant rate, right? So, but at least we're now seeing, and I mean, maybe in your own community, maybe in your own city, but you're starting to see that there's some underlying fundamentals that are definitely changing. This, I mean, it's, and as this gentleman suggested, and if you look at the debt levels for Canadians in correlation to, as he suggested, to their wages, it's such a divergent plane. It's like it's way down here for your wages and way the fuck up here, took off like you're on a roller coaster. That's unsustainable even for the most economically illiterate or financially illiterate among us. When they see that, even just a chart, they see that don't look right. They might not be able to understand the underlying fundamentals that's happening, right? And the macro picture, but any, even a person with limited IQ would see, hey, that doesn't look right. So, yes, of course, Canada, like I say, laggards. U.S. went through their correction. European Union went through their correction. A lot of countries around the world went through their correction. Canada have not. And they sat back there in the media, fuckers especially, tried to put forward and present this narrative. Hey, no, there's no chance that happened in Canada. Don't worry, we're way better than everyone else. Canada. Yeah, we're the best in the world, right? Dang. I mean, I would like to think that, but first of all, Canada, we're not a collective, we're not a board. That's a voice of singularity that sounds so fucked up even when you hear it. It's beyond reproach, but most people are used to listening and digesting that kind of collective mentality that they don't completely understand and be able to separate the reality from the rhetoric, right? You're seeing that there are people that are trying to help you out. But if you're the one that kept, listen to the rhetoric of these political propagandists or these speculators or these market manipulators, hey, you're the one that's going to have to deal with the consequences. I won't. I made sure that I was well prepared, well in advance to this point, so that it's like, nah, you're not going to catch me in your little trap, your little mouse trap. I didn't fall for any of your snake oil. I don't like snake oil. I have no benefit for snake oil. And you can tell me that my house is a lottery ticket. You can tell my house is now like a debit card or an instant ATM. But I know it's not. And I would never want it to be. I'm not that foolish. I'm not that naive. And I'm definitely not economically illiterate. It's a Canadian Libertarian. And I love liberty.